back to Judah, to the temple, takes a couple things, and decides to take the royal sons as a way to kind of control Israel. If their sons are over there, they're not going to come retaliate. And remember, his father dies, Nabonidus dies, so he runs back to Babylon, and then the kids are deported back to Babylon. They're from Judah to Babylon, and that's what Habakkuk is watching. Habakkuk is watching that they had this godly king. Now he's dead. This one king gets put in. He dies after 3 months, and then Egypt, there's a battle, and after that battle, Egypt comes, puts in a puppet king, and they immediately turn back to idolatry. And he's watching this wickedness grow. Then he sees that Babylon is coming to take them over, and he's like, really, Lord? Like, of all the people groups, Babylon, they're evil. And they were. There's, if you read some history of the Babylons, like Nebuchadnezzar was not a nice guy, but he was open to truth. And that's what differentiated him from Belshazzar. Okay, so that's the brief history. So Nebuchadnezzar's reign is this far, and then now 602, that's 3 years after the boys have had their education, and they're been put into the sect of the wise men, and Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, which nobody can answer except Daniel. And Daniel and his friends pray about it. God reveals the vision or the dream to Daniel, and he goes and tells the king, and Nebuchadnezzar puts him in his palace. And remember, Daniel asked for his friends to be put into higher places too alongside him, and he does that. Nebuchadnezzar does that for Daniel. And then in 586 is the third deportation of Israel, and about 597 would be the second deportation. That's when Ezekiel would have been brought over, and 10,000 of the other, like, more common, they're not nobility, it's more common people were brought over into the kingdom of Babylon. And then the third deportation is when he destroys the temple and Judah. And Daniel 3 happens somewhere in that area, and that is the statue that of gold that Nebuchadnezzar sets up. And remember, what he's trying to do is he's done with his conquering. He's trying to unify his kingdom. And so he comes up with the bright idea to unify them through music, because, his kingdom is made up of different countries that speak different languages and have different religious beliefs. A lot of them are overlapping, but different cultures. And so he's trying to unify them, does it, and he's also doing this because at that time, we know from Jeremiah that the king starts trying to build a rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar of Judah. The king of Judah is trying to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar and telling him that God is going to restore us now. And remember, Jeremiah writes, no, that's not true. Like, build your houses, settle down with your families, and just enjoy the ride, because we're here for a while. We're here in Babylon for a while. And that's when he goes in and destroys the temple and just obliterates Judah. 570 is Daniel, around 570 is Daniel 4, chapter 4. And that is where we see what happens in Daniel 4. I don't know why I'm blanking out. Oh yeah, that is when he humbles Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has the dream, and for about a year, Daniel tells him what the dream is about, that, humble yourself, change your ways, and what he's telling him to do is, like, you think you're getting arrogant, prideful, and you need to know that you have all of this because God has given it to you, and God is the one who's in control, and without him you would have nothing. And he kind of toes the line for about a year, and then after a year he can't help it. Remember, he's looking out his window and he's like, look at great Babylon that I've built. And God immediately switches his mind to make him think he's an animal. And we see that's when, after 7 years, he finally looks up and he acknowledges that God is the Most High. And then he sends out like a gospel tract to the whole kingdom of Babylon. And I love that because we see that God loves the Gentiles, and Israel refused to be a light to them and to draw them to the Most High God. And so God takes 4 boys and he brings them over to this wicked pagan Gentile kingdom, and he uses them to really educate this king, right? In Daniel 1:8 it says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not sin against God. He wouldn't do anything to make himself unclean before God. And they had a boundary, and they wouldn't go past that boundary. They would do whatever they were asked of within this pagan kingdom unless it made them sin against God. And he used that to show Nebuchadnezzar that he is the Most High and that everything he has is from him. So I believe he gets saved in chapter 4, and then he sends out the whole gospel message to the whole kingdom so that they would hear. And remember, his kingdom, well, we'll see a map in a minute where his kingdom was. And then that brings us to Daniel 5 with Belshazzar and his father, Nabonidus. And I said that Nebuchadnezzar's father was Nabonidus. His father was Nabopolassar, I'm sorry. And then that's when the kingdom is taken from is destroyed. Babylon is destroyed by the Medes and Persians in Daniel 5 around 539. And that is where we're going to pick up today in chapter 6 with Cyrus and Darius. So you guys got it? You could repeat that all back to me now? We've got a solid grasp on that. Yeah. I don't know if I could. So we're going to get into Cyrus. We saw that he took over last time. They came in and took the city. And remember, an important thing to remember is that at this point, his father, Nabopolassar, we're talking about Belshazzar. Remember, they had the big banquet, and they had all the idols. His father had brought back all the idols when he came back to Babylon because they were being under attack. And they're having a big feast. And remember, the Medes and Persians are camped outside the city, but they have so much arrogance and pride and thinking they are protected in their city. They have enough food for 2 years, and nobody can break their walls. And we saw pictures of how the depth of their walls and stuff. And he's inside, and they're having a big feast. Remember, at this time, all the leaders, the political leaders of Babylon have come to the empire of Babylon, have come to the city of Babylon, and they're hanging out in the city thinking they're going to be protected there. And they had a big feast, and they're just worshiping the false idols, thinking this is going to, one of them at least can protect them. And that's when Belshazzar has the bright idea. The Israelites in the country don't have idols, so they bring in the temple things, and then he drinks out of them. And at this time, Nabonidus has already been captured. He's already captured, and one of his generals, Gabirus, I think is his name, has defected to the Medes and Persians, and he's the one who tells them to, how they can get in by draining the Euphrates River is what they did. They drained it, and then they walked into the city through the tunnels of the Euphrates River, and there was no battle, no fight. They just pretty much walked in and was like, we're here, take over now. And I think because of the kingdom was really unstable at that time, and they weren't worshiping Marduk, so they attributed that Nabonidus worshipped a different god, and so Marduk punished them, and that's what Cyrus thought too. Okay, so here I just put in another timeline, which we're not going to go through, but I want you to see that Daniel 7 and 8 is like a flashback, and that happens in between Daniel 4 and 5. And so we're getting into the Persian government, but when we get into 7 and 8, we're going to be going back in time to Daniel's visions. So when Cyrus comes, or Darius, we'll call him Darius, Daniel has more information than we do because of his visions. So if you don't know about his visions in 7 and 8, you can go read about him, but he has more of an idea of God's working, and we'll see that in chapter 7 when we get to Daniel's prayer. But so he has more information coming into this situation. And so here's another thing. This is something I believe Amy Ward drew up, and I like this. So if you guys want a copy of this, did I give you a copy? Did you steal that from me? I'm just kidding. Yes, so I can make more, or have Linda make more. I'm just teasing you. I might have given it to you because I have a copy too. So this one just kind of breaks it out with a little more information on what's going on, because there's a lot going on, and especially if you didn't sit through the first 5 chapters. Anyway, so if you want a copy of that, you can have a copy of that. Let's move on. So, of course, I put some maps. So I want you to see, we're going to start with Cyrus now, and I want to talk a little bit about Cyrus before we get into it. So I want you to see, I don't have just one map. I have at least 3 maps, right? Okay. But this map I like. So you see Assyria, but you see the Media and the Persia. And you see the Media, they're kind of like a mountainous people. They kind of live in the mountains. And the Persians there is some mountains, but it's more of like plain lands near the water. And I just want to go over like a little bit of the history, and it'll be better because I wrote it out and I won't be trying to recall in my brain what I think I know. So this is where we're starting. We're starting with Cyrus being in charge, but I want to take you through how Cyrus got to be in charge and how the Media and Persia became kind of one country or whatever. And at this point, Media is more powerful. So I'm just this is the Cyrus the Great story. So a man named Astyages became king of the Medes in about 585 BC. So Media was actually located in Persia, which is modern-day Iran. So that's where we're at. The Medes and the Persians, they were in constant conflict, which if you start reading about history, they're all in constant conflict, always fighting against each other. But the Medes were superior in this case. And so the Persians were kind of under their authority. So Astyages, so he has a dream. Astyages, he had a dream. Well, first he had a daughter. He had a daughter named Mandane, and then he has a dream about her. And the dream is, it's kind of crude, but she's urinating, and she urinates so much that it fills the whole kingdom, like up to the tops of the mountains. And so he calls the Magi, which, remember that, which are the wise men, and he asks them about the dream. And they warn him that it means that Mandane will have a son that will overthrow him and take over his kingdom. So when Mandane becomes of the marrying age, Astyages, being fearful of the dream, he decides to not marry her off to any of the Medes, whom he considered a worthy opponent of himself. But he chooses to marry her off to a man that he considered of little importance, thinking this would lessen the likelihood of any sons of hers growing up to be powerful or more powerful than him. And he found a good man, good home, mild nature, and it's a Persian named Prince Cambyses. So the Medes consider the Persians to be lesser than them, so that, there's nobody that they won't be able to overpower the Medes' kingdom. So Mandane marries, and she moves to Persia and eventually gets pregnant. Astyages has a second dream of Mandane giving birth to a son, and then this time after she gives birth, vines come out of her womb and spread over the whole kingdom and cover the whole kingdom. And so he consults with the wise men again, and they tell him, yeah, you gotta take out this kid. And so he sends for her to come home, and I think she gives birth there. It's not really clear, but he hatches a plan to kill this baby when it's born. And when the baby comes, he calls for his trusted officer, Harpagus, and he gives him the child, and he gives him strict commands that this child, you kill the child, right? And then bring it back and we'll bury it. And I'm guessing he was going to tell her it was just stillborn or whatever, but Harpagus, he vows to not let the king down. He's a faithful servant. He says, okay, king, I'll take care of it. And on his way back, he takes it back to his wife, takes the child to his house, because you can't just they need the baby back to bury it. So you can't just leave it out or just, it has to be almost like let to die. And he has a tender moment of weakness. He's looking at the child and he decides he can't kill the child. So he hands it off to the king's poor herdsman to kill him. So he doesn't think, oh, I'll save the child. He just thinks, I can't do it. I'm not going to do this. And he gives it to the king's herdsman, who's poor and just kind of lives, takes care of the king's herds and stuff. So he hands off the child to the herdsman named Mithridates, and he instructs him to kill him by leaving him exposed on the mountain or something, and the elements to deal with him, and then bring him back, and I'll give him to the king. So he takes the babe home, where his wife, who happened to be pregnant, and happens to give birth while he's talking with Hargopagus, she gives birth to a stillborn son. And afraid, Mithridates is afraid of disobeying Hargopagus' orders. He tells his wife of his plans, and she begs him to save the baby's life. Like, don't just save the baby's life. And she says, give him our stillborn son. He can have a royal burial, and we can raise this one, and nobody will know the difference, and we'll save this baby's life. And they call the boy Artabares. So when Artabares, or Cyrus, which we're going to call him, was about 10 years old, he was playing king with some of the local boys. So he lives right on the king's property, and they would play together, but they played together. And the boys, they were playing king, and they elected him to be their king that day. And he gave orders, and he organized them into farmers and soldiers, and he appointed officials and messengers and spies. And so they had this game going, and one boy, who happened to be a noble son, disagreed with him and said, I'm not doing that. He wouldn't obey Cyrus. So Cyrus commands his soldiers to whip him, and they did. They whipped this noble boy, these common people, and maybe there's probably other noble boys there too. So they whipped this boy. So the boy goes home. He complains to his father, who then goes to the king Astyages and telling him of the ordeal, and demands that this Cyrus be beaten. Which is interesting, because you think the nobleman would have just went and dealt with Cyrus himself, but I don't know if that gives us like a little insight to this king, that he was controlling and micromanaging, and just you had to go put everything through him. But I just found that interesting, but I don't know. So Astyages, he sends out a soldier, he fetches Cyrus and brings him back to punish him. And when Astyages questions Cyrus and asks him if he, a poor peasant boy, gave a noble boy a whipping, Cyrus, instead of, kind of cowering before this king and being afraid, he boldly just stands before the king, and he says, yes, and I was within my rights, because the boys had elected me king, and he wouldn't obey me. And, as he's talking to this boy and looking at him, and his confidence, and listening to as he boldly just makes his case, he starts putting 2 to 2 together, that the boy looks like him and acts like him. And he realizes that this is his grandson that he had 10 years ago. He puts the timeline together, and this has to be his grandson that he had executed or sentenced to death 10 years before. So he questions the herdsman in Hargopagus, and he is furious, but he remains calm with them. So he assumes, though, but at the same time, he calls in his wise men and talks to them, and they're like, yeah, that's the fulfillment of your dream. That's what he was talking about. And so he doesn't really see Cyrus as a threat anymore. He welcomes him back into the palace, and he lets the herdsman go home to live in peace, and he's done with him. And he invites Hargopagus to a meal, like a celebration, a banquet, at the palace, seemingly forgetting about the whole matter. Well, he didn't, because he's a vengeful king, and he plots vengeance on the unsuspecting Hargopagus. He throws a banquet to celebrate Cyrus and has Hargopagus' son killed and served as a meal to Hargopagus. So after the meal, the king reveals this to Hargopagus by throwing the boy's head and remains in a basket at his feet. And Hargopagus just scoops it up, takes it home and buries his boy, and in his mind, or his thinking, his heart, determines to have vengeance for the death of his son, but doesn't retaliate against the king at all. Fast forward, Cyrus goes back home to his real parents, his birth parents in Persia, grows up, and when he's older, Harpagus starts secretly influencing him to lead a Persian revolt. And in 553 BC, he does this against his grandfather. They managed, and they go to battle. He goes against his grandfather, and they managed, the Medes managed to hold off the Persians for about 3 years. But Harpagus, like, this shows the king's arrogance and how arrogance leads to blindness. He puts Harpagus in charge as like his lead general. And so Harpagus is still angry and he wants to get back at the king. So he puts him in charge, and as they go against the Persians, he is creating a mutiny with the Mede army. And he's encouraging them to switch sides. Go be, put your allegiance with Cyrus and the Persians, and leave Astyages, this horrible guy, behind. And that happens, and in 550, Cyrus defeats his grandfather. And so how he deals with his grandfather gives us some insight to Cyrus and his belief system. So instead of killing his grandfather, Cyrus allows him to live quietly in his court. So he treats him with kindness. And this is due to the fact that Cyrus was a devout Zoroastrian. Hold on, I have more. Okay. Let me just show you the maps, and then I'll show you some other things. Because I forgot, I had pictures for you to go through so you could watch pictures. Okay, so here we see, this is Babylon at the time, and then we have the Medes and the Persians, and how they're defeating everybody before they go. But we know that they eventually take over all that land. So they take over more than the Babylon. The Mede-Persian kingdom spreads more further than the Babylon. And then I had a picture of little Cyrus playing king, ordering the boy to be whipped. That's him on a horse. I'm assuming he's going to war. It's not really him. But this is his belief system. It's Zoroastrianism. And Ahura Mazda is the name of their god. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Zoroastrianism. So it believes that Ahura Mazda is uncreated, like he had no beginning. He's benevolent, right, kind, and he's all wise. He's omniscient. So this is what they believe about this God. He's hailed as the supreme being of the universe, and his opposer is called Angra Mainyu, and he's personified as a destructive spirit and the adversity of all things that are good. So that's his evil. And the Zoroastrian religion, it combines dualistic cosmology of good and evil with eschatology, like the outlook of predicting the ultimate triumph of good over evil, which is going to be Ahura Mazda will overcome evil. And it's if you go like study it, it's kind of a really weird religion. It's kind of all inclusive sort of, but it's exclusive too. But basically it's monotheistic, but it has polytheistic things and henotheistic things all in one belief system. So the ultimate purpose, though, here's where Cyrus's mind frame comes in, and this is why this is important, because this is how he deals with the countries he takes over. And we see that God uses him to send the Israelites back to Israel. So the ultimate purpose for Zoroastrian's life is to become an Ashavan. It means a master of Asha, or a master of truth. And it's Zoroastrianism truth, though, not real truth. And to bring happiness to the world, which contributes to the cosmic battle against evil. So if you're contributing good and you're being kind, and then you're going to help in this battle. You're going to help win over evil. And that's the core teachings. It's like a threefold teaching: good thoughts, good works, good deeds. And it's to keep one's soul aligned with Asha. That's the truth. And through spreading happiness. And the spiritual equality and duty of men and women alike is to spread happiness. And so Cyrus's belief system led him to practice religious tolerance. So he was a tolerant leader who allowed his subjects to practice their own religions. And he ruled by the Zoroastrian law of truth and righteousness, but didn't oppose other people who he conquered. And let's just look at, we're going to look at the government structure a little bit, but turn with me to Daniel chapter 44. We will get to the real slides, I promise. So Isaiah chapter 44. Tell me you need sleep without telling me you need sleep. Okay, so Isaiah 44, verse 28. I'm going to read down through verses, chapter 45, 1 through 7. So now remember, Isaiah is like 100-ish years before this all happened. And so he says, who says of Cyrus, so he's predicting Cyrus, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to your temple your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the crooked paths straight. And we think about Cyrus's life, it was pretty crooked. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that you may know that I, the Lord, who call you by your name, am the God of Israel. And isn't that beautiful, that verse right there? Like, I'm going to let you know that I'm the God of Israel. You know, you worship Ahura Mazda, I'm going to show you Israel's God. For Jacob, my servant's sake, and I'm doing this for Jacob's sake, in Israel, my elect, I have even called you by your name. I have named you, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know, from the rising of the sun to the setting, that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness, right? The good and evil. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. And so this was prophesied 100 years before this happened, and Daniel would have known that. Daniel would have known about this prophecy. He was just a scholar of the scrolls, and he would have known of this, and he did because he had more insight too, was he? But anybody who studied this, the scriptures would have known about Cyrus being named, and so when Cyrus came, it's no surprise to them. So the government structure. This is a government structure that is now being brought into Babylon. So the government, it was a hierarchy. So remember, with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kings, it was like a monarchy, and what they said was law, and that's what happened. And remember, where do they think law comes from? The gods, whatever god they're worshiping, the law comes through them, and they're just like a vessel to communicate their god's law. So this government structure was a hierarchy, and the emperor was top. But then he had administrative officials and advisors just below him and secretaries below him. And so the empire was divided into provinces, which we're going to see, or satrapies, administered by the Persian governor or satrap, who was responsible only for civil matters. And military matters in a satrapy were handled by a general. So it's kind of like our government, a little bit like split, and you have these different, places of leadership and who's in charge. And so this is how we're going to see that when a law is made, even the king can't change it because he really doesn't have that much authority, because he has to go through the government officials, and that's kind of how our government is set up too. Like, the president shouldn't have all power. He has to go through the right channels, and once they agree on a law and it's set, then it's set. And then I put this up here because I found this as I was like searching, and I thought, how interesting. Like, this God, the Zoroastrian God, is not dead. Isn't that crazy? Like, you can buy this t-shirt. It just shows how we are where we're heading. All right. In your books now, whatever page. What page is it again? 67. Okay, so that's the background of where we're heading. So let's turn back to Daniel chapter 6, verse 1, and I am going to read through verse 9. So let's back up to verse 30. It says, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius the Mede, now we'll talk about Darius the Mede, received the kingdom being about 62 years old. So actually, I'll just tell you now because we're going to be reading. So we read about Cyrus the Great coming. There's different thoughts on who Darius the Mede is. I think it's the same person, and I'll tell you why I think that. I think it's just, he's also called the Mule. Cyrus is called the Mule because he's Mede in Persian. He has a Median mother and a Persian father, and he's the Mule. And I just think it's just, like you have like Peter and Simon, or Daniel and Belteshazzar, like they had different names according to the culture. And so I think it's the same person. Wickham thinks it's Gabryas, the general who had defected, is put in charge of Babylon, and he's kind of ruling Babylon, the city of Babylon now, not the empire. But the reason I think it's more likely it's Darius, because we're going to see the power that Darius has, and the power that Darius the Mede has isn't a power. If he's only in charge of that city of Babylon, he wouldn't have the power to make the laws and rule the way he is over the whole kingdom of Persia now. So that's what I think. You can study it yourself, come to your own conclusion. So when we say Darius the Mede, I think it's Cyrus the Great, but let's read on. Okay, verse 1, chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom, so he's setting over the whole kingdom, 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, the satraps, the counselors, and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree, that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. So let's go back. So we have the history of Persia's rise to power. 1, the history of the Persian Empire involves 2 groups of people, the Medes and the Persians, who joined forces to conquer the world. Whoops, did you guys get that? Okay. In 539 BC, the Medo-Persian Empire came to power by conquering the Babylonians. With the acquisition of the Babylonian Empire, the total landmass under Persian rule doubled in size. So here's a little picture. You can see that was Babylon. Doesn't look so cute now. Can you guys see that okay? And now this is the Medo-Persian Empire. And we see they took over Babylon in 539. They took over Babylon, the city. Remember, before that, they had already conquered most of the Babylonian Empire by taking over different cities. But the stronghold was the Babylonian city, and that's what they took over in 539. So eventually, Persia ruled the Middle East, Egypt, the Caucasus, and much of modern-day Pakistan and India. They also had a huge influence on Central Asia, which is modern-day Turkey, which they conquered and controlled for centuries. See, they were never able to substantially break into Europe and fully conquer the Greek city-states, but they did manage to make the Greeks their avowed enemies. And the reason they couldn't break into Europe was because God had put boundaries on them. And we need to remember that when we see different countries taking over different places. Like, nobody's taking over anybody unless God allows it. And we see Babylon was only allowed to go so far. We're going to see that Medo-Persians were only allowed to go so far, and Greeks were only allowed to go so far. And if you read some secular history, you'll see that when they would try, if they wouldn't stop trying to break into countries God didn't want them to, there's one general who just died. He just died, or king, and he couldn't, that was it. The conquering was done. So God is in control. That's the point of that. Okay. The first Persian king was Cyrus. God had the prophet Isaiah prophesy concerning Cyrus by name more than 100 years before his birth and his subsequent rise to power. And we've just read that in Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. I think that should be 29. But all right, just as God had said, do you remember how long God said they'd be in captivity in Babylon for? 70 years. And just as God said, 70 years, the Jews would be free from Babylonian control. It doesn't mean they'd be free from, their kingdom wouldn't be restored, but they'd be free from Babylonian control. So the Persians under Cyrus were responsible for liberating the Jewish people from Babylonian captivity and then encouraging their return to the land to rebuild Jerusalem and its temple. Daniel's book teaches us about God. Daniel 1. So this is like a review. And as we review this, we just want to remember, Daniel gives us chapters 1 through 6, the historical thing. We know a lot more happened in Daniel's life. You get the impression of Daniel that he was the guy you went to if you needed issues solved. You had a question, you went to Daniel. But we only get a few accounts of him. And that's just Daniel showing God's grace in action. And so in Daniel 1, God displayed his control over circumstances by allowing Daniel and his friends to find favor and advancement in a pagan government, right? Daniel became like number 2. And then his 3 buddies were sent out in different areas to control, different cities to control, or countries. God sent these believers out to be in control and spread news about him. And so throughout these chapters, we see God's grace to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah for their faithfulness to him. And we also see that he showed grace to Israel despite their disobedience, right? He has a covenant with them, and he's faithful to that covenant. And he showed his grace to the pagan nation by showing them who he is. And so Daniel 2. Through Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, God displayed his comprehensive knowledge or omniscience by revealing precise details concerning the times of the Gentiles. And remember, secular people think Daniel was not written when it supposedly was written because the details are so precise, and they don't have an answer for that. Daniel 3, God displayed his power to save by delivering the 3 Hebrew youths through the fiery furnace. 4, Daniel 4, God displayed his sovereignty over human authorities by humbling the most powerful monarch on the earth, in King Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. He is the monarch to attain to. He's the one that you want to be like, because he was the most powerful king, and he had the most powerful kingdom, even more powerful than the Medes and Persian. He had unity. And we see as we go down through these kingdoms, we're going to see even within the Medo-Persian kingdom that the element, which is silver, gets a little stronger, but the unity of the kingdom gets weaker. And so we see that as we go down through these. We want to just always keep that in mind. Daniel 5, God displayed his justice by eliminating Babylon as a kingdom the very night King Belshazzar led his people to blaspheme and disregard God's holiness. In Daniel 6, God again displayed all these attributes: control over circumstances, complete knowledge, power to save, sovereignty, and justice when he delivered Daniel from the lions. And that's what we're going to see in Daniel 6. So the Most High God is going to show Darius the Mede, just like he showed King Nebuchadnezzar, who he is. And as we go through these kingdoms, we want to remember the first king is the king that represents the kingdom. So the kingdom of Babylon is represented by Nebuchadnezzar, and the kingdom of the Medes and Persians is represented by Cyrus. And we're going to see Greek kingdom is represented by Alexander the Great. And so that's who represents the kingdom, and attributing, because by the time Babylon was taken over, they were weakened because of weak leaders, but they were the strongest because of Nebuchadnezzar. And the same we're going to see with Cyrus the Great, or Darius the Mede. All right, Daniel 6:1a. Who was Darius the Mede? Daniel 6:1a. It seemed good to Darius. So we see that in Daniel 5:3, which we read. So Darius the Mede was likely a co-regent with Cyrus the Persian, appointed to rule over the Babylonian aspects of the Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel 6:28, which we'll see, says Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, in the reign of King Cyrus the Persian. This is one of the verses why I think they're the same person, because you could translate that. Darius prospered in the reign of Darius, even in the reign of Cyrus the Persian, or who was also the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So you can look that up. Let me know your conclusions on it. Okay. Yeah, we already went over all that. Well, let's just look at one. So let's go back to 1 Chronicles 5:26, and we're just going to compare Daniel 6:28 with it, where it says that. So 1 Chronicles 5:26. And I'll give you another example of a name being used like that. 1 Chronicles 5:26. Okay. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is Tilgath-Pilzer, king of Assyria. And so we see that it's two names, same person. So 1 Chronicles 5:26. And so, yeah. So, but I mean, if you want to believe it's Gabirus or whoever, you're welcome to do that. I won't dislike you, and I won't even argue with you. All right, Daniel 9:1 confirms Darius' appointment over Babylon. So in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. So when we get to Daniel 9, we'll see that. We won't turn to that, but he's ruling over the whole kingdom. That's why I think they're the same person, because if Cyrus the Great is the king or the emperor or whatever, so and Darius might, the word Darius might be a title also, but anyway. I digress. Okay, some historians have a problem with Darius being a real person because there seems to be no extra biblical record to identify him. And a lot of these places have been excavated, but not much. Like, remember Ephesians, the Ephesus is only, what we saw is only like 20% of it, maybe less excavated. So these areas, you're talking about Iraq, Iran, the only reason Iraq was more excavated was because Saddam Hussein thought he was Nebuchadnezzar and had it excavated. So, yeah. Okay, so, all right. Although it is difficult to be dogmatic about his exact identity, we can absolutely be dogmatic about the inerrancy of Scripture, right? We don't say, well, it's not been proven, so I'm not going to believe it. We say, this is what God's Word says, so the burden of proof is on you to disprove it. And, it just takes the, one dig, and they'll dig up a cylinder and find information, which they did. They actually have a cylinder of Cyrus. But okay, so Jesus Christ never doubted the historical trustworthiness of the book of Daniel. He quoted from the book of Daniel as if it were completely accurate. And of course, Jesus never made mistakes. So let's look at Matthew 24:30, and then we're going to compare it with Daniel 7:13. So Matthew 24:30. Says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So let's turn back to Daniel now and just go to chapter 7, and we'll look at verse 13. I was watching, this is Daniel's vision. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And so Jesus is quoting from Daniel, and I have a list of New Testament quotes from Daniel if anybody didn't get one when I passed them out last time. So you must not allow the criticism of skeptics to discredit the Bible's accuracy, right? Out of everything going on in this world, the chaos we're in, the uncertainty, you don't even know what you watch, if it's real, if it's AI now. Satan's doing a great job of creating chaos, which is his goal, I think. The only thing we know for certain that is truth is the Word of God. And so this is where we need to spend most of our time. We need to get our thinking to be aligned with this, because we need to be discerning and be able to filter things, and through the Word of God, and even as we see this person coming into leadership or this country attacking this country, like, what does God say about that stuff, and who's ultimately in control? And that's God. Nothing is happening without his knowledge and without his consent, right? We know that even Satan has to go to God to get consent to do things. We see that in the book of Job and with Peter. So Daniel 6, 1b through 3, Daniel's success in the Persian Empire. Daniel 6, 1b, it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. And satraps were regional leaders. Darius strategically employed indigenous leaders to manage the affairs of the empire in their respective regions. And this was a normal practice back then. It's like taking over a company and then leaving those in positions that they know how to run. Instead of retraining people, they already know it. They're familiar. They know the culture. They know the people. And so you leave them in charge. In Daniel 6:2, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one. So you see how that works? He puts 120 people in charge, and then there's 3 that are over them, and Daniel is one of them. And I surmise that they had heard of this Daniel. They might, Daniel might have even had dealings with them, because he was, Nebuchadnezzar's number 1. And they probably heard of these crazy happenings too, with the boys getting into the fiery furnace, and Daniel being able to tell you what your dreams are about, and even tell you what they were. And so I'm sure word got back to these countries, and they probably knew about this Daniel. But anyway, okay, so in over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. This suffering loss is like money. He's not going to lose out on money. He's going to get the taxes that he's due. So Daniel was one of the 3 appointed presidents over the 120 regional leaders. The presidents answered directly to Darius. Their task was to ensure that the satraps were honest in collecting taxes and other revenue. So because the land mass of Persia was greater than that of Babylon, it needed this kind of organizational structure to manage and control its expansive and multicultural empire. Remember, there's many languages spoken and different belief systems and cultures. And this gives you an idea of what they were. Can you see that? Is that too blurry? Can you see the different colors? That's just gives you an example of, how the kingdom was divided, and why, how big it was, and why it needed this sort of structure. If you want a copy of that too, I can print it for you. So here's another, maybe a little clearer. It's the same names, it's just not divided up like that one. So it's a vast, big area for them to try to reign and keep control of. Okay, so see, instead of doing away with the previous Babylonian leadership, Persia decided to incorporate it in its government structure. And since Daniel had recently been appointed the number 3 leader in Babylon, he was likely a natural choice for one of the 3 high positions. Daniel 6:3. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. And Daniel was honest and capable, and he was excelling in the new government. I'm sorry, I keep leaving that up there, don't I? Yeah, sorry about that. Okay. Let's look at Daniel 5, 11 and 12. And we're going to see this extraordinary spirit. So Daniel 5, 11 and 12 says this. And remember who this is? Belshazzar's mother. There is a man in your kingdom. So this is the queen mother. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. And then go to chapter 4, and let's look at verse 8. So that's Queen Mother. That's a high up noble lady. And 4:8 it says, this is Nebuchadnezzar, but at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before him, saying, all right, and then one more. Let's go to chapter 2, verse 47. The king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, and the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. And that's Nebuchadnezzar giving credit to Daniel's God, not Daniel. And here we have these high up officials, these kings who usually end up considering themselves as gods, or like they're a vessel of their God working through them. And this queen mother, who they see this extraordinary spirit, there's something different about this Daniel. And go back to chapter 1, verse 17, and I'll read one more verse. And so it says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And this whole book really is about Daniel using this special gift from God, right? God is the one who gave him the ability to do this thing. And Daniel just obediently follows him and obeys him. And it's him using his special gift and conducting his lifestyle in such a way that these people are seeing something different in Daniel, this extraordinary spirit. Okay, so he was slated for promotion. Nearly everything in the kingdom, over nearly everything in the kingdom, but he was also Jewish. And that was a problem for some of his peers. His ethnicity and honesty would have won him a host of corrupt and jealous enemies. Now, Daniel at this time is around 80 years old. Let's not forget that. He's gone through the whole kingdom of Babylon, which was 70 years, and he was taken when he was about 15, so he's probably like upper 80s, 85 or something. And so he's not like a young boy anymore where they'd look down to him, but he is a Jew, and he is looked down. There's anti-Semitism sprinkled in here. So these guys don't like that he's about to be promoted over them. And so Daniel was probably accustomed to conspiracies by his peers. Being an honest person in government, he would have been a problem for anyone who might be taking advantage of his position, and powerful for unethical personal gain. And we remember in Daniel 1:8, what did he say? I have purposed in my heart that I will not defile myself before my God. And he was not going to make himself unclean before God for his own pleasures, and he's certainly not going to do it for these corrupt officials who want to do evil things like skimming off the top of the taxes or whatever they want to do. He's not going to allow that, and so they don't like that. So Daniel 6:4-5, jealousy, an ugly matter. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence of corruption was to be found in him. The conspirators could not find any fault with Daniel. So these guys, they honestly thought they would find something corrupt in Daniel. And why? Because that's how they are. They have corruption in themselves, inside themselves. And they're assuming, right? And this is what people do. They assume that you are like they are. And they're looking at it through their point of view. Like, we would do this, so he probably will too. Or he's had to have done it in the past, because they've all have these skeletons in their closets. And assuming that because he's been a high official in Babylon for so long and now here, that he's had to have done stuff for his own personal gain, like taking bribes or, skimming off the top or just being dishonest. And these guys want to be able to do corrupt things for their own gain. And who's in their way? Daniel. And so this word faithful is the word amah in Aramaic, and it's a word for believe or faithful or sure. And we see it in Daniel. Let's look at Daniel 2:45. And we're just going to get a review of Daniel's character here. So Daniel 2:45. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God has made known to the king. This is not the right verse. 2:45. Oh well, go to 6:23 maybe. Wait a minute. 2:45. Hold on. Let me just see if I can get back in my mind and remember why I put that there. Oh, okay. Okay, 2:45. He's telling Nebuchadnezzar about the stone cut without hands that's going to destroy the Gentile empire. And the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation is sure. So this is just Daniel. He gives credit to God. He's not going to take any credit for being able to interpret this dream. And then go back to 6:23, and it says, now the king was exceedingly glad for Daniel, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And so that's it in 2:45 too, that he told the king, the dream is certain, its interpretation is sure, like because of who that came from, God, it's going to happen. And that just shows Daniel's faith, his belief in the Most High God. So let's see. Let's look at Isaiah 46:10, and we're going to see just some more on this. So Isaiah 46, verse 10. And this is, remember, Daniel knew the book of Isaiah. And he says, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. And this is who Daniel is placing his faith in, not the government, not other people. It's in his God, and he knows his God will bring about what he says is going to happen. And then go to 2 Peter 1:19. Just do a New Testament book too. So 2 Peter 1:19 says, and so we have the prophetic word confirmed, which you do well to heed as a light that shines in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts, right? God gave us his prophetic word so that we can know him and we can trust him. And Daniel knew God, and he believed what God said. And he trusted that God was in control and that God would take care of him, that nothing would happen apart from God allowing it. And Daniel doesn't think, oh, nothing bad will happen to me because God will protect me. He thinks, no, nothing apart from what his will is will happen to me. And the same with Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah is that they had that same faith. Like, right? What did they say? Even if, King, you want to throw us into that fire, we know our God can protect us. We don't know that he will. But either way, even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to you. And that's the attitude we need to get. That's what needs to be in our heart, our thinking, is that God is in control and he allows things to happen to us. And our job is to know him well enough that we respond in the proper way. And that's pretty much the Christian walk, right? Okay, so Daniel was loyal to the king and his character was spotless. He was not negligent in his work. He did not put his personal interests above those of the king. No one could find any fault in what he did. And so let's turn to Philippians. So this particular slide set wouldn't let me add slides, I don't think, so we have to look them all up. So let's look at Philippians 2:15. Okay, that you, well, let's back up one. Let's back up two. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, or grumbling and complaining, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God, without fault. Where? In the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. And that's God's desire for us, to shine as lights in the world so that we can draw people to him. And then let's do 1 Peter chapter 2. And we'll read verses 11 and 12. And he says, Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, right? He's given them a proper perspective. This is not your home. Abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. Having your, right? And he's saying your battle is in your mind. Having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. And this is what's happening to Daniel. Because of his good works, they're plotting against him. And they hate him for it. B, we might be tempted to praise Daniel, but we know he prospered because of God's work in his life. As he aged, he grew in dependence on the Lord. He learned to live for the glory of God rather than for selfish gain, and this was spiritual maturity in progress. Daniel 6:5, these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel. They knew it. Unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. These deceitful men eventually conspired to destroy Daniel based on his loyalty to God and his word. And remember, these are pagan guys. They worship different gods, and their gods are kind of a mess when you start looking into the different types of gods. Like, there's a lot of fighting and, like, corruption within their own belief system, their gods. They don't understand the Jews' God. And so we have to just kind of have a little compassion on them, that they're going through what's in their thinking. The problem is not that they were raised and they have this thinking. The problem is that they don't want to know the true God. They're content in their pagan beliefs and practices. All right, so they knew they wouldn't find anything corrupt in Daniel unless they made a law against his God, specifically the law of his God. So they planned to pass a law that makes what Daniel does before his God illegal. You know, like sharing the gospel on the streets, or teaching the children in school, or something of that matter. That's what they're trying to do. And they knew Daniel would not forsake his God and obey something that went against the Most High God. And they are counting on Daniel. They're counting. They are sure that Daniel is going to be faithful to his God. That's the whole point. We're going to make this law against his God, which we know he won't disobey, and then we've got him. And so we see the contrast between the law of God and the law of the Medes and Persians. And we see this phrase repeated. They're going to repeat this, the law of the Medes and Persians. The law of the Medes and Persians. We read all throughout this book. And it's because once it's set in motion, once it's signed, right? They can bring laws before the king, and they're null and void until the king signs them, and then it can't be undone. So, but God's law, that's man's law, the Medes and Persians, but God's law is going to stand above their law, and that is what Daniel is going to obey, right? So he obeys the Medes and Persian law. He has nothing against submission and being faithful to the king and obeying the laws, unless they ask him to go against the Most High God's laws. And he's going to obey the Most High God regardless of the law, the Medes and Persians. And so Daniel's integrity was so intact, his conspirators realized the only way to get rid of him was by means of his strengths, his unbending principles and worship of God. They would have to use deception in order to trap, blame, and ultimately destroy Daniel. So they had to conspire against him. They had to use deception against Daniel. And they had to use deception against King Darius, which we're going to see in a minute, how they start right off with deception to the king. And it's funny because what they're going in to accuse Daniel of is not being loyal to King Darius. He's unfaithful to King Darius. Is their leading sentence is them being unloyal to King Darius. All right, I'm getting too excited. All right, B, they may have known that Jews did not worship idols. The story of the three Hebrew youths who would not disobey God and worship an idol, even in the face of death, may still have been told at this time, which I'm sure. These men decided to trick the king into enacting an irrevocable law, similar to Nebuchadnezzar's demands to worship a false god, which would ensnare Daniel. Because of the law of the Medes and Persians, even the king would be obliged to carry through on its death penalty requirements. Oops, okay, we are at the end. Do you want to throw it up a little bit? We have like 20 minutes. What do you guys say? Keep going? We're just getting to the good part. Okay. All right. Are you ready? You have 070 up? Okay. I'll go back to the lion head. Well, I'll just talk then. So I love this about Daniel. I love seeing when Daniel is, and the other boys are challenged about obeying God, and they just stand firm over and over and over. There's no wavering in Daniel that we ever see. And the fact that these guys, these are the headest, I'm assuming it's all 120 satraps and then the other two leaders that are conspiring together. And they have access to all probably the old Babylonian history and going-ons and government stuff. And they've poured through it, and they cannot find one thing wrong with Daniel. There's not one time he has done something bad and was disloyal to Nebuchadnezzar or any of the other kings or Cyrus. I think this happened soon after Cyrus has started ruling, but they can't find a thing. And so they come up with a better plan or plan B to get the king to pass a law against the God of Daniel. We good? Not yet. You can't get it to work? Well, anybody have any questions so far? Chapters 1 through 5? Or thoughts? Huh? To be like Daniel, right? That's the ultimate goal. Well, to be like Christ, right? That's what he was doing. I guess the secret, I think, to the Christian life is just not just taking in God's word, but it's taking it in and believing it, right? If you don't believe what God says, then you're not gonna obey it. And it's as you believe what God says, and you see how he's worked through history and how he's directing it, it just should confirm your faith in him. And that's what we see God did with these boys. I think when they were still over in Judah, I think they had time to pray with their parents and say goodbye and really decide that we are not going to sin against God while we're taken over to this pagan country. And they set their boundaries right then. It was already they set that they weren't going to sin against him. And so when they were taken, they already knew they had their line drawn in the sand. And we're going to be the best. We're going to study hard. We're going to be faithful to this person, because us being faithful to this king is actually being faithful to God. We're obeying God. We know that God, right? Isaiah prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar was coming to take the noble boys. So they knew God was in control. And God just shows them throughout their captivity that he's still there. I'm with you here. And he lets these little things happen. And I'm sure there's a lot more God did for these boys that we don't have privy to. But they knew who God was, and he just kept faithfully showing them and just reaffirming their faith in him. Like, I am faithful to you, and I do know you, and I remember you, and, I'm going to have you, find favor. I mean, before Daniel even got to Babylon, he found favor with, was it Azariah? Is that the guy's name? Or Ashpenaz? Whoever the guy in charge of bringing them back to Babylon, he fell in love with Daniel. He loved him like a son. And they weren't even in Babylon yet. And so he's already showing favor to this boy. And I can't wait to meet Daniel. Like, he must have just been an extraordinary person, and just because these people are just drawn to him, and they see something, this, Spirit of God in him that they don't see in other people. You never hear about them again. I'm assuming they are, but Daniel's not alone now. Also at this time, like, he has Ezekiel. Ezekiel's been brought over, and so when God brings over, I like to think God brought during the second deportation, which 605, like, it's less than 10 years after the first one. He brought over, like, the common folk and stuff, more people over. I'm assuming probably like a lot of the rest of the nobles, like, he kind of left it as a skeleton city. He might have even had his parents brought over, and if he had siblings and other people, they're all brought over to this kingdom. And I love how God does it, though. Like, you think about the 3 deportations, and God does it in steps. First, he brings over these noble boys that are inserted into the kingdom, and the 4 of them are put over in charge of everything, kind of like greasing the wheels, getting ready for the rest of the Jews to come over so that they won't be persecuted. We can assume that Daniel, he's in the sect of wise men, and Nebuchadnezzar allowed him to set up a school to train them now in the Jewish scriptures. We know that because of the Magi coming over, right? We see that Cyrus also has Magi, right? He has wise men that he counsels with. Coming into Babylon, like, when the Magi come over, it's from the same thing that Daniel was part of, the Magi. And now this kingdom has the Magi, and so they're from the east, and whether they were Iranian or Iraqi or whatever, they were Babylonian, Chaldean, or Mede or Persia, these wise men are carrying on with what their teachings from the scriptures of Daniel, because they're looking for this Messiah of the Jews. So how God just, he slowly inserts them into this kingdom and rises them up into power. And then as the other ones are brought over, they're going to be treated fairly. And so that's just God's grace. He's protecting his people. He's punishing them, but he's protecting them at the same time. And it's just really a beautiful picture when you just step back and you look at, like, the realistic thing of what's going on. And like, Israel never went back to idol worship after they were taken into captivity, which is bizarre. That's what they're punished for worshiping idols. God puts them, inserts them into all these places that they have the freedom to worship idols now, and they don't. It's like that God knew exactly what kind of spanking they needed, discipline they needed, and that did it. I mean, they still corrupted God's law and added to it, but they never went back to the pagan worships, and that's what happened after Josiah left, right? Josiah was a godly king. He took down the strongholds, and he saw the law and started teaching the law again, and they started turning back to God. And then as soon as he dies, they like almost instantly go back to their pagan worship, which shows like they may have changed in their practices, but in their thinking they hadn't really changed. And that's when God just says, okay, that's it. Like, now you're coming under discipline. And his judgment was set. And Nebuchadnezzar was, already on the move. He was already on the march by that time. And, I think they knew, once they heard the name Nebuchadnezzar, if they knew the prophecy, they'd probably be like, uh-oh, we're under discipline. But any other thoughts or questions or?
I think it just emphasizes the fact that knowledge of God is not belief in God.
Right.
And anyone can spit out facts about it.
Yeah.
You can look it up, you can know all kinds of things, but at the end of the day,
Yeah.
it's belief.
Yeah.
It talks about, you think about like even the demons would acknowledge God.
Right. Yeah. We see that in Ephesians, right?
You see that all the way through.
Yeah.
It really boils down to
Yeah.
true belief.
Yep. Professing to be wise, they became fools, right? Even believers can do that when all you have is head knowledge. It's that transformation, right? It's getting the I do, right? Those are the to know the facts, that word I do, and then you transfer it over into what's the word for like understanding and believing it is gnosko, yeah. And that's when it becomes like epinosis is when it becomes like part of you. It's in your heart now, and you're thinking of who you are as the truth of God. But if you don't open the scriptures and you don't get to know him, I think that's why the Old Testament is so important, because you really get to see God's grace in action. That's how I like to look at it. Like, it's God's grace in action, because when you first just read through, some of these books are pretty traumatic. There's like traumatic stuff, evil stuff going on, and it's really God revealing he is in control and he is directing history. And the beautiful part is like God directs history, right? What God has ordained is going to happen, but we get to be a part of it. We don't have to be, but we get to be. And our decisions aren't going to affect his plan. So I shouldn't say we're a part of history no matter what, but we can be a positive part of it or a negative part of it. And, as believers, we can choose to just go after the world, but God's plans are still going to stand. And he still might even utilize us in his plans, but we can be a positive part of God's plans, and he can use us to further his history for positive things and get his will done, like he does with Daniel. Like, Daniel's life was hard. It wasn't easy. And, even ruling over all those people, that's not an easy job. It's like, oh, he got elevated. He's the boss now. He's not like kicking back and drinking tea. He's probably traveling, and he's dealing with other countries and other people. And, especially if they know he can do things, and he's probably getting all these people sent to him. And, he was just constant, though, that constant faithfulness to God. And in a studier of God, we see that. And we're going to see that too when we get to chapter 7. Like, he was in the scriptures all the time. That was his spare time. He was in the scriptures, and that's how he finds out about Daniel's 70 years, which we're going to see is he's studying the scrolls of Jeremiah. And so how did he get the scrolls? How did he get the scriptures from Jerusalem, from Israel or Judah, right? I mean, either he went and got them and got permission from the king, or they brought them with them when they came over, but we see how Nebuchadnezzar, having favor on him, has given him, we'll say, religious freedom to worship his God and do it overtly. He wasn't in secret, and he doesn't, we're going to get into this next time we get together. We're going to see that he doesn't go pray in secret. He's not going to do that. He's not going to change his ways. And we'll end with this. I'll tell you, he's not going to go pray in secret, because if he goes, they know his habits. They know that he goes and prays 3 times a day. And when we get to it, we'll see why he prays 3 times a day. And we'll even talk about what he's praying about, which I think is revealed to us in chapter 9. But he continues to do that because if he didn't, they're going to look at him. It's going to affect how they look at his God, right? And it's going to deter from that. So he says, no, like I'm not going to disobey my God and what I'm doing and wreck my testimony before you or the king or anyone else because I'm afraid. And he goes and he does, it's almost like I picture it like this law gets passed. Daniel hears about it. He goes back to pray, we're going to see. And those guys are like following him, like looking in the windows, like, oh, there he goes. Yep, just right on time, like we thought, right? Noon, he's doing the noon prayer. And he doesn't care. He doesn't care about the punishment. He knows the punishment. And it doesn't matter. Like, God's going to allow what God allows, but he is not going to wreck his testimony to protect himself. And we'll just end there because we'll just call it early. So that's good. I almost at one point didn't think we'd get through one set of slides. So it's okay. God knows it would have been too rushed probably, and we'll go with that. So I'll put up, just leave the king up.